Wild man. Well, good morning, Heartland. Good morning. Jesus invited one gentleman to take up his bed and walk. I just chose to take up my table and walk, but it was so I could join you this morning, and I'm really excited to do so. This was not the plan. At least it wasn't our plan. It wasn't our plan. It was the plan that Dan would be the one speaking to you this morning. But Dan and Kristen took some time to celebrate their 15th anniversary in Boston, a place they really enjoy, and he brought something back with him that has put him in bed. So he is sick and taking some time to hopefully recover and heal from that. So we're missing him this morning, and I'm sure he's missing us this morning, if for no other reason than he wishes he weren't sick. But let's remember him, pray for him, full recovery for him. With Dan and Kristen's trip, it actually reminded me that some 20 years ago, Judy and I spent a few days in Boston. We'd made an East Coast visit, we participated in a close friend's wedding, and then stayed up in that area, and we took advantage of our time in Boston because we were so intrigued by the historical message that is Boston. And we took the time to walk around Boston and to get familiar with some of the historical markers. They've gone so far as to paint the street, and you can follow these various paint paths that will lead you into the historical story of who we are today and how some of its first steps took place. And those monuments and those markers just serve to remind us that real people participated in real experiences that have made a real difference. That real people participated in real experiences that have made a real difference. See, that's what markers do. Sometimes we feel like markers unfairly or inappropriately elevate people that maybe shouldn't be elevated. But the reality is, without them, we lose the story. And when we lose the story, we lose the significance of what took place that made it possible for us to be where we are today, to have the experience we have today, and to potentially pass that on to the next generation. That's what we miss. So to go back into a place like Boston and to be exposed to those monuments and marks is a real privilege for us. And we can do that all throughout the United States. One of the things Judy and I found helpful is when we go to an area we're unfamiliar with, especially one that's rich in history, we'll go to a cemetery or two, and we'll read the headstones. Because oftentimes in the brief phrases that are captured in those places, we have a sense of connection to the people and the experiences that went before us that have yet had a significant impact on us, even today. And that's what Boston can do for us. Monuments mark the people and their actions that make today possible. That's what monuments do for us. They mark the people and the actions that make our today possible. They're really important for us. And here at Heartland, what God has led us into, as Brad mentioned, is this season of remembering through the eyes and experiences of the children of Israel how it is they came to terms with God's presence with them and God's activity with them and the faith action choices they had to make in light of that. I just want to encourage you, even as Brad did, hey, if you're visiting today or you're relatively new to Heartland, just want you to relax, receive what's appropriate and fitting for you, but don't feel any pressure or compulsion. If God has a word for you or a challenge, you'll know that. He's really good at that. But we just welcome you and want to encourage you to be here with us. If you're a Heartlander, welcome to the challenge. All right? It's a safe one. If you know who God is and believe what He's up to, it's a safe and good challenge. We've been drawing insight and inspiration from this story of Israel and from the life of Joshua. We've been tracking in this story God's actions, people's choices, and then the effect of those. Joshua is a key leader in this story because he's actually been a part of something most of this generation he's leading have not been a part of. He has so much more experience and story to tell. And what's evident as we move into chapter 3 and 4 here of Joshua, these people, this generation, needs to have an experience of God that fills in some blanks for them personally. One of the things I think God has given us the opportunity to do is to share our faith and really even kind of borrow from other people's faith for a time. There are times when in need or in deficiency, we really need the faith of someone else to help our faith. And in the same way, others need our faith to strengthen and encourage them. But ultimately, all of us are invited by God into a fresh experience of faith, a fresh experience of Him that then populates our story, my story, and your story, and fills it out so that we can offer it to others. And one of the ways we offer it to others is with these markers or these monuments or memorials. They serve to invite the story of who God is and what He's done, who I am and what I've done, and what might be possible for you. So in this story that we're stepping into the middle of, just a quick recap, Israel had been in captivity in Egypt for years and years. And God chose to deliver them from that captivity with a leader called Moses. And Moses leads them into the wilderness, but one of the first barriers they encounter as they leave is the Red Sea. They need to get to the other side of the Red Sea, and they're trapped there. The Egyptian leadership they're very upset that Israel has left. Their slave labor has departed, and they're really unhappy with this. So they're pursuing them, and Israel is trapped between the Red Sea and this pursuing army. And God chooses through Moses to part the Red Sea and to provide dry ground for Israel to pass over to the other side. And they're passing over into a land that God had promised them. And so as the story goes, they pass over, and the army of Pharaoh, the Egyptian army, decides to pursue them, and God chooses to close up the sea. So Israel has one experience, a divided sea and dry land. Pharaoh's army has a hot tub they hadn't anticipated. And they don't make it. And Israel's left with a story of God's great promises and provisions and power. And it becomes a culture, people defining story for them. Well, as it would work out, Joshua was actually a part of that experience. And as they get to the land God's promised them, Joshua becomes a part of a team of people that are going to spy out the new land. And in spying out the new land, they come back, and 10 of them give a message of fear, and 2 of them give a message of promise and hope. Joshua and his partner Caleb, a message of promise and hope. God will provide. He will overcome the barriers that we've seen there. He will provide what He's promised. The other 10 said, "No way, Jose. This is not happening. We go, we die." And as a result of the people responding to the negative message instead of the faith promise message, that people wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and died off. And a new generation has risen up who did not have that Red Sea experience. And yet now they're being invited into the land God has promised, and they once again have a water barrier to overcome. Now I want to pause for a moment and just kind of take ourselves inside Joshua's experience. Many of you are old enough to think back 40 years. If not, imagine. Imagine the longest part of the life you can remember. And ask yourself, if I think back over 40 years, what are the few moments I might remember that so defined me, I marked them down, like I captured them. I either wrote them in a journal, or I took a picture of them, or I bought something that represented them 40 years ago. So think about Joshua for just a moment. If you were Joshua 40 years ago, you who had trusted God were invited to spend 40 years burying everyone who didn't. I've not had that experience. I'm actually overwhelmed by that experience when I consider it. Sometimes we use the phrase death of a vision. Oh my goodness. This is the real death of hundreds of thousands of people who chose not to trust God for what He promised to provide. And so Joshua spends those 40 years burying these people, only to the men be called by God to the leadership role and commissioned to lead this new generation into the promised land. Can you appreciate why this was hard for Joshua? I mean, how quickly can you turn from a funeral to primary leadership of a group of people? How quickly can you do that? How quickly can you turn from thousands of funerals, thousands of burials? 40 years worth of that. Man, I don't turn well from that. I don't know about you. It just takes a little bit of difficulty for me. And I'm wrestling with turning, to truly trust God and to step forward in what He has for me. And I need the benefit of a community of faith to help me do that. It's part of what's embedded in this we will call of Joshua at the end of this story. And the we will yes of those people is they realized they actually needed each other to write the next chapter of the story that wasn't about death. It was about promise and provision and power, and they're experiencing it. They're experiencing it, and therefore they have it to offer. Why does God choose to do this way? I think one of the reasons He's chosen to do it this way is because He's looking for people who will completely trust Him. People who will completely trust Him for who He is and for what He will do. And those go together. My first inclination may be like yours. I'm wanting to trust Him for what He'll do because I need Him to do things for me, right? I have a do list. And He says, I do too, and it's really good for you. But I want you to have me. I want you to experience me. I want you to be filled with me. And when you are, my do list will make far more sense to you than your do list. And you'll like it a whole lot more. But until you get to know me, we just have comparing do lists. And those usually don't work out very well. They're certainly not faith-raising for us. So we need markers of God's presence and activity, His promises and His provisions, and those markers then keep speaking of the God we can trust. And so here's what's expressed in Joshua chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. I want you to take steps that will remind your children of my presence and my activity. So leave this up for a moment. Let me set a little more context. They've come to a river that's at flood stage, the Jordan River, and God has called them to cross the river, and He's told them exactly how to do it. And one of the steps in the process will be that those who are carrying what is called the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is this tangible container, this ornate box, that represents some of the key artifacts of Israel's journey with God, but it represents God's presence. And so God has instructed them, when you come to the river to cross it, those who take the ark forward, the priests, will step into the water, and as they step into the water, it will divide and dry up, and they'll be able to cross on dry ground. Now, He asked that they stay in the middle of the river while this procession happens. And so that's going to happen. And He then instructs Joshua, choose 12 members, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to gather up a large stone from the middle of the river near the Ark of the Covenant and take it with them, must have been large, on their shoulder to the other side. And those stones will become markers of my presence, of my promises, of my provisions for you, and my power to make it possible. So that's what's happening. So He says, I want you to know that in the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones put together in this monument, what do they represent? And then you can tell them, they remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. And these stones will stand as a memorial, as this marker among the people of Israel forever. These kinds of markers give us the opportunity to tell the story of God's presence, His provisions, His power, and our decision to act in faith in keeping with that. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, so let's just take a moment and appreciate what they're up against. If we were to use the stage to represent 2 miles, just this output right here, this is a 2-mile stretch. To give you perspective, we are about 2 miles from College Boulevard here. Do you know where that is? North of 119th. We're about 2 miles from College Boulevard. So take that distance and turn it this way for just a moment, okay? This is 2 miles. Now, this represents the width of the Jordan River at flood stage. You appreciate that? Okay? It's gone from anywhere from like 50 to 100 feet wide to now 2 miles. And it's gone from a depth of about 5 to 10 feet to maybe 100 feet or more. So it's a wild river. So we're going to picture this wild river coming out of Kansas City, Missouri. I just want to clarify that. This is a river coming out of Kansas City, Missouri, because it certainly wouldn't come out of Kansas, would it? Not this kind of damaging river. So it's and that's about 20 miles away, and this will be significant in just a moment. God tells Joshua, when these priests with the Ark of the Covenant step into the water, they must step into the water first. This is different than the Red Sea. Moses held out his staff and the water divided. He's saying, no, you're going to step in it. Have you ever felt that kind of call of God on you? You're going to have to step in it. He's promised, and He has provision and the power to do it, and you must step in it first. So they step in it, and the river is going to divide, and they're going to be able to walk through on dry ground. That's the story before they do it. That's the story. I want to look at it for you. Just take a look at a map that might help you unpack this, okay? Here's our width of the river at flood stage. That's our stage here, 2 miles. And back in Kansas City, Missouri, I'll call it a dam. It's Adam for many of us, but we'll call it a dam. And here's why. Because when the priests stepped into the water, as instructed by God, with the Ark of the Covenant, the water stopped. It flowed on down to the sea, and it backed up to a dam. I just want you to remember where the water stopped, and it was dry ground. Now, here's part of the instruction that's kind of subtle in the story, but because of the holiness that the Ark of the Covenant represented, the children of Israel were told as they passed to stay 3,000 feet away from it. It was part of what God was teaching His people about Himself and about them. He was intimately present with them, but He was holy and separate from them. He was intimately present with them, but He was holy and separate from them. And in that mix, He was making the provision they needed. He was dividing this water. He was creating the dry ground, and they were passing over. Come back to the map for just a moment. So when the priests stepped in, the water finished running, this backed up. You have this 20-mile dry path to cross over. I don't think they needed the whole 20 miles, but they needed to be a little over a half a mile from the ark and then cross over. Now, as they did this, they bring the camp to Gilgal, which is this location right here, a couple of miles from Jericho, one of the first cities that they will take. And at Gilgal, it is where Joshua brings the 12 leaders and their 12 stones together to build a monument, to set up a marker that would set up the storytelling that was essential to take these personal experiences and translate them into future generations. Because every generation needs its own experience of God's presence, His promises, His provisions, His power made personal to them. Every generation needs this. While the next generation needs our faith, they need the faith to trust God for the personal experience they need to give them strength in their faith. This isn't a borrowed faith. It can be a leveraged faith for a time, but it has to become theirs. It has to become personal. And that's what memorial stones do. So these leaders cross the Jordan and they gather the stones in the dry riverbed and they bring them over to Gilgal, and Joshua sets them up as this memorial. This wasn't to present them the opportunity to just look back. This was to give them perspective about how God sees them and about how to look ahead to the many challenges they have yet to face. This wasn't a one and done for them, but what was done helped redefine everything else that God would do. Can you appreciate that? I mean, personally? Have there been those moments for you that when God has acted, it redefined what was happening between you and God? It helped you see who God was differently, and it gave you a story to tell others. It recast your experience of God. That's what He's inviting us into. The teaching here is very simple. Make your life full of monuments. Make your life full of memorials to God's activity that someday someone has to ask you, what does this mean? What does this mean? Judy and I have recently moved again, and in moving, we're reminded of all the things we've not taken out of a box in about 10 years. I don't know if you've had that experience. Mission Olathe has been the beneficiary of some of that new discovery from our boxes. May it bless many. But in the process, we come across memories. Some of those are in the form of photo albums. Some of those are like my dad's snow skis or my dad's snowshoes. And so now I got my dad's snowshoes hanging again. Now, he made those snowshoes. So when I see them and I consider his life then, he was an adventurer. He grew up in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains up in New York, and so he was up in the mountains and he was hunting for living and all of that. So it's like, wow, it takes me there even though that's not my experience. And it invites me to be an adventurer, giving of myself to what's required in order to have the experiences I desire. Those snowshoes are a monument to my dad's activity that speak into my life today. My dad was a man who came to faith in his adulthood, and so I have that story as well with my dad, and many markers of his faith to me. That's what our monuments or memorials do for us. They set us up to tell the story to someone someday of what God has done, that He's present. He makes promises. He has provisions for you and me and the power to bring them off, to make them happen. That's what these stones remind us of. Every monument is a pointer to a life-marking act. But this monument, this particular monument, this stack of these 12 stones, points so directly to the faithfulness of God, His promises and provisions, and then the faith actions of those who said yes to God about this. Let's jump into chapter 4 of Joshua and pick it up in verse 19 and catch a little bit more of the story. Let's read this together. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones that they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed it. Again, this generation, 40 years removed from the previous generation's experience of crossing the Red Sea on dry ground, they now have their own story to tell. They have an experience that they can offer to the next generation. That isn't simply to say, hey, capture what we had. No, it's to say, you can in fact trust God as we did, and He has experiences for you that will build and grow you with confidence in who God is, what it is He has to say and offer, and how it is He brings it about. Let's go on as we read. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what He had done to the Red Sea when He dried it up before us until we'd crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. This fear the Lord your God idea is a way of expressing His invitation to us to the kind of relationship that keeps Him and me in right position. He is God and I'm not. I am His loved son. You are His loved son or daughter. We can trust that relationship as the most honest, the most transparent, the most life-giving relationship possible. That's what these experiences are designed to tell us. God and who He is worthy of our complete trust. That's the thing about a memorial. A memorial marks a moment of movement that should not be lost or left in the past. That's what a memorial does. That's what these stones did. They marked this moment of movement that should never be lost or left in the past. So why do we take time to celebrate? Those of you who are making fresh decisions to trust God and to give, maybe for the first time or differently than you have before, you've taken that step, or you've chosen to make it a regular priority for you, or you've chosen to give more. You have a story associated with that. There may be an opportunity for you to capture a memorial, something that may invite a future conversation about who God is and your faith action step and how others can trust Him similarly. Memorials mark the movement that should never be lost or left in the past. Why is it we've put the focus on we will on our giving? Why have we done that? Well, because as we began to consider the challenge we felt rising toward us from God, we recognized that this matter of money is one of the most sensitive, most significant areas of our life any of us deal with. And for many of us, it's not an open subject. It's a sensitive, guarded, kind of fearful subject. And we felt God was inviting us into something so much more than that about money. We also recognized that money for us is one of those idols for us. It's this marker of where the power rests, of where our sense of self and definition rests. And we know God wants and has so much more for us than that. And so we followed His lead into this issue of marking our faith steps with giving steps. Trusting God with our money and giving in faith and giving freely and giving generously. It has the potential of generating more faith, not only in us, but in those who get to know the story of our faith choices. And this is what happens on the journey of faith. When we take small steps of obedience together, they become big steps and big stories that really help fuel others in taking their steps. John and Vicki Auld have been faithful part of Heartland for years, and John has offered to share his story of some of the choices God presented he and Vicki with regard to giving. And I'm going to read it as he's offered it. And I want you to just consider how it is this reflects their experience of God leading them to see God for who he was and to trust him and to act accordingly. He says this: from the very beginning of our marriage, Vicki and I religiously, in quotes, tithed 10% of our gross income because we thought it was what made us good Christians. We tithed before we paid our bills. We tithed when we couldn't pay our bills. And over time, we went into debt due to layoffs, poor economies, foolish decisions, and growing medical bills, but we still tithed. After 15 years, we finally decided it was ridiculous to tithe, only to then need help from our church and our family and our friends. So we stopped tithing, and eventually we stopped going to church too. I just mentioned earlier Joshua's own experience of burying the unbelieving for 40 years. Sometimes things just need to die, don't they? We may not realize it at the time, but God has something so much better for us that until this dies, we don't discover the better. Some of that's a part of John and Vicki's story. Not tithing meant we had more money to spend, but the debt kept growing, especially medical bills. So in January of 2010, we decided to go back to church and chose to attend Heartland. After almost a year of good teaching and community, Vicki and I began to feel uneasy about not tithing while we were being fed spiritually. But we didn't want to get back into the bondage of owing God again. Good call. There was a teaching that explained that God owned everything anyway, and that even if we gave a 10% tithe, he was still actually offering us the freedom to live fully on the other 90%. Even though we were in significant debt, Vicki and I prayed about it and decided to trust God with giving back to him what was his to begin with. And we felt good about our decision, and we started to give freely and joyfully. Big shift, not obligation, freely and joyfully, for a couple of weeks. And then Heartland started the Beautiful Fight campaign. Now, this goes back to a very significant move and the finishing of that move from our previous location out here to our Olathe location. And in that campaign, the ask was for an additional 3-year giving commitment above and beyond our current giving. I know some of you are probably expecting that to happen in this series, aren't you? No, it's not going to happen in this series. That's not what this series is about. That would be valid, but it's not about that, just know. Now, what were Vicki and I supposed to do? We'd already made a major new commitment. We decided to answer this with prayer. We chose to go to God and talk to him about it. And did God want us to give extra or didn't he? And in the end, we felt God told us to give more, and so we did. It was really freeing and fun to trust God with the finances he had given us in the first place. We not only met that 3-year commitment, and we continued to set aside that amount each month, just in case God had someplace else he needed us to give it. And that debt, even with giving to God and the continually growing medical bills, with God's miraculous grace and some sound financial practices, we were out of debt within 10 years. God is incredibly gracious when we begin to trust him. That's a memorial stone. That's a memorial stone that John and Vicki have in their story. John, thank you for offering that to us. Yeah. God has a story for you. He has an invitation for you. And that invitation is gracious and full. It's not a bondage. It's not an obligation. It's an invitation. You know, what we've all learned over the years is that kids in particular learn best in a few different ways. One is they learn best by example, and then by observation, and then story. And this new generation rising up under Joshua had example. They had Joshua and Caleb. They had observation. They had seen how they lived through this period, and they had their story. But what they didn't have is one of the things kids need is they didn't have their own experience. And God gave them this experience at this crossroads. He set them up to experience him in ways that would fill their faith story out. and position it to offer to the next generation. It's fascinating to me that in this moment, on one side of the Jordan, the people of Israel are eating daily manna. As they crossed the Jordan into Gilgal, they ate a meal produced from the fruit of the promised land. Oh, what a change. What a change that could only be experienced if they trusted God who was present, who had promised, who made provision and had the power to bring it about, and their faith actions accessed what he had for them. The reminders these stones offered were to tell us, hey, in the future I can gain strength as I trust God in the same kinds of ways. What are the markers in my home or in yours that would cause someone or our own kids or grandkids to ask, what do these rocks mean? Mom, Dad, what's the story these rocks tell? And at a minimum, keeping yesterday's faith actions fresh for tomorrow, our memorials declare this: God did it again. God did it again, and he will do it for you. God did it again, and he will do it for you. What might those memorial markers be for you? What might be the stones, the way you can capture and share what has happened with you that represents who God is, where your faith was stretched, and what happened as a result of that? Judy and I just returned a week ago from a visit to Eagle River, Alaska, where our daughter, son-in-law, and grandkids are. And our youngest in that crew is 8 years old. And when he was about three and a half is when I underwent open heart surgery. And that anchored an experience with him that has resulted in this. Almost every time we get together, sometime during the time we're together, he'll want to see my scar. Now, I didn't have an interest in that kind of memorial marker. I didn't sign up for that. I didn't know I needed it. I'm so glad I have it. Little did I know that our little third grader would be indelibly impressed or marked by that story. But every time it gives me an opportunity to speak of God's presence in the face of fear and uncertainty about that time. His promises, no matter how this goes, he can be trusted. The ways he chose to provide, the faith actions required of me, all captured in a scar. My confidence is God has given you markers and memorials that capture for you moments where you really needed to know God was there and that he cared. That he could be trusted with what was so tender and difficult for you. He could be trusted with that. That he had provisions for you. He had the power to bring it about. And he wanted you to experience it. So that you could say, God did it. And he will do it again. That's what he's offering us in this story with Joshua and these people. Recognize that God was certainly empowering Joshua's leadership, but his life and leadership moved the hearts of probably over 2 million people to boldly cross the river into the promised land. Who knows what impact God intends for your story, for what you have to offer, for the marks of faith for you. So we're going to take just a minute or so here at the end give you an opportunity to do some reflecting. I'm going to pose some questions that may prompt you in this reflection. Are you up for that? Are you good for that? Okay, let's just take a moment. If you want to capture something, I'd encourage you to. If your memory is still better than mine, remember it, hold on to it. But I want to prompt you with some of this because it ties to what God may be offering you and me today from this story. I felt very challenged by this scripture. I have way too few memorial stones. I'm challenged by that. My guess is you have memorial stones that you would do well to capture and display as a marker, as a source of story. So here are the questions. What is a memorial stone? A story, a marker that speaks of God's financial faithfulness to you. Where you've really felt tested by this, you didn't know. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds. Where have you needed the water parted and the ground dried so you could go from where you were to where you needed to be? And his invitation was, you're going to have to step in it first. Trust me and step in it. What's a memorial stone, a story, a marker that speaks of God's financial faithfulness to you? Take a moment. A second question is, what faith actions in giving have you taken that speak of the faithfulness of God? What faith actions have you taken that because of taking them, they speak of the faithfulness of God? What might some of those be? And I'd encourage you, don't minimize them. If it seems small to you, capture it. Give some attention to it. If it's big, capture it. Give some attention to it, but capture it. Here's the last prompt. Who might be strengthened by your story? And who can you imagine sharing your story with? That they may gain a sense of God's presence, His promises, His provisions, His power, and your faith actions. Who might be strengthened by your story? I've been strengthened today by John and Vicky's story. I hope you were as well. I hope you are strengthened as you reflect on God's experience you've had. I want you to capture that and be able to memorialize it. Offer it up as a stone that tells a story of faith. God's actions, your actions, faith-building actions. Join me in prayer as we finish this morning. God, we so need you to meet us at our Jordan. We need you to meet us at this place we feel like is insurmountable or uncrossable. It is now defining our reality rather than you defining our reality. We need you to meet us there. As the Ark of the Covenant served Israel, we need to be reminded of who you are, of your greatness and how it has been manifest. We need to be reminded that when you invite us to step into the water, you have gone before us. You are making this happen, not us. We're simply following you into it, and you are bringing it to be. However small or seemingly insignificant this may be, Jesus, anchor it in our hearts so that we keep it. We connect the story of it. We share it with others. Do that, however big or small these faith moments are. May they become the kinds of stones that cannot keep their mouth shut. For even the stones will cry out of your great faithfulness. Give us the kinds of markers and the kinds of memorials that cry out of your great faithfulness, Jesus. For you are trustworthy and faithful, and we thank you. Build our story, grow our faith, help us act out of your greatness. We'll trust you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, Heartland, thank you for the opportunity to be Dan this morning. And may he fully heal and recover and be back with us causing trouble really soon. Have a great week. Go Chiefs.